Hey guys, this is Conf Studios here, and in today's video we're going to be going through Great Adventure Controversial Takes number 2. So before we get into the video, these are takes that you guys submitted. These are not necessarily ones I agree with, so I'm going to be going through what you guys have submitted, giving my opinion on it, how valid I think it is. Now of course, everyone's entitled to their own opinion. Some of these are pretty out there, hence why they are controversial takes. So we're going to get started right away with the first one. Nitro over El Toro. Now, obviously, I personally do disagree, but I think it really depends on your taste in coasters. El Toro is easily one of the most extreme coasters out there. It has some of the best ejector airtime. It is certainly not smooth. You need to know where to ride for it to not be rough, and it still will beat you around a little bit. Nitro, on the other hand, it does have its rougher moments, but it's nothing like El Toro's roughness. It's a much more gentle ride. It still has some good forces, like in the helix, and some of the airtime hills do deliver when you're in the back row. For the most part, it's definitely a much more tame ride experience, so if you're into the more floaty sensations and not necessarily the most extreme or insane rides, the Nitro is probably the one you're going to prefer. So this is definitely something I could see a lot of people thinking, but personally, my taste in coasters, I will take El Toro any day of the week. Next up. This is one I don't entirely disagree with. Skull Mountain, back when I was younger and first started riding it in the early 2010s, this was always one of my favorite rides at the park, mainly because it had quite a bit of theming in the queue and in the ride. The queue theming is still there. It's definitely a little weaker than it used to be, but during the ride, pretty much all the effects are gone now. And at this point, I very rarely ride Skull Mountain just because, honestly, it feels like a shell of its former self. There used to be sound effects throughout the layout. It was completely pitch black in there with the exception of the effects. And the effects were really cool because they would kind of jump out at you and really catch you off guard. But now, there really aren't any effects. You're kind of just riding around in a not even pitch black room, which I think definitely takes away a lot from the ride experience. I've been saying it for a while. I really wish Skull Mountain would get a refurbishment and restore it back with a lot of the effects that it's missing now. I thought it was cool when they did the Skull Mountain remix during the Power Hours event and Summer Vibes, but it definitely wasn't the same as the way it used to be. So this is one I definitely could see some merit for. Next up. Now this is one that when Jersey Devil was first being built, I thought could be true, and then we all rode Jersey Devil, and it wasn't really as great as we were expecting it to be. It's not to say it's a bad ride, but number one at the park, I know some people might think this, but I think as the recency bias kind of wore off on Jersey Devil, it's definitely top 4 in the park for most people, but number 2 or number 3 is probably where it lands. I don't think many people would call it number 1. I mean, whether you like El Toro, Nitro, or King Ka best, most people will take one of those 3 rides over Jersey Devil. Like I said, Jersey Devil is not necessarily a bad ride, but it does a lot of very similar things to, say, Nitro or Toro, where it has the airtime of Toro. It kind of has a similar layout to Nitro in the sense that the elements are kind of spaced out and it's not all in rapid succession. And it obviously doesn't really have anything similar to Ka, but most people are going to take Nitro or El Toro over Jersey Devil if that's the ride they prefer. So personally, I do see El Toro as being better than Jersey Devil. Depending on the day, sometimes I'll put Ka over Jersey Devil, and sometimes I'll even put Nitro over Jersey Devil. Again, just completely depends on the day. But this is one I could see for some people, but for most people, no. Next up, King Ka isn't rough. Now, this is one I agree with depending on the seat you sit in. If you're in the front row, it is really smooth. One of the smoothest coasters at the park. And if you sit somewhere else, that's where it changes a little bit. I've noticed that the front row of a car tends to be a little smoother than the back row of a car, but it's also different sensations. The back row of a car will kind of push it more on your spine more. You'll feel it more in your back, all the G-forces, and then you'll get that rattle. But in the front of a car, you don't get it as bad. But again, it depends on the train and the car, so really it's ride to ride how rough it'll be. I wouldn't really call it a rough ride. I'd just call it kind of rattly in the same sense as like Sandy's Blasting Bronco. I wouldn't call that ride rough, but it definitely has a rattle to it. So people that complain that King Ka is one of the roughest coasters out there, personally, I don't agree with it. Next up, Dark Knight over Green Lantern. Personally, I strongly disagree with this, but it depends on your opinion on Green Lantern. I happen to think Green Lantern is a really good ride. I think it's one of the better coasters at Great Adventure, so that kind of leads me to see it as definitely being better than Dark Knight. Dark Knight is a fun ride, but I definitely would not say it's better than Green Lantern. I would put it over something like Skull Mountain maybe, but any higher than that, I can't really say so. But again, if you're not a big fan of Green Lantern, this is definitely one I can understand. Next up, Washbuckler is a ride that tends to be forgotten about at Great Adventure. Most people coming from afar don't even know Great Adventure has one of these super roundup attractions, but it is a really fun ride. I don't know if I'd call it a top tier flat. It definitely has some really strong forces with that centripetal force being active in the ride, though again, when you're looking at rides like Zumanjaro, Wonder Woman, I don't really know if this stacks up against those. It's a good family ride, good ride to get your day started, get spinning a little bit, get used to the sensations, but top tier flat, I'm not too sure about that. Next up, so this is kind of two I've combined into one. People that think Ka is better than Devil, and people that think Devil is better than Ka. So I'm going to focus more on Ka being better than Devil, because I know that does tend to be a little more unpopular. People tend to like Devil more than Ka. Personally, I actually do prefer Ka to Devil as of right now. Like I said, completely depends on the day. These rides are all very close to each other. I think Ka packs in more of a punch and is more consistent with how good it is, especially during the 2023 season. Devil can very much so depend on how full the train is. If you have a really full train and it's a hot day where the ride's running fast, I would take it over Ka. But if that's not the case, I can't say I would. So really, it comes down to personal preference. It's kind of a toss-up between these two. But like I said, personally, I do think Ka is just a hair better than Devil, but again, that's debatable. Next up, Great Adventure is the coaster capital of the world. Now, this is definitely an interesting one, as there's quite a few parks that are obviously contenders for this. I'd say the two obvious ones are Magic Mountain and Cedar Point, both of which I think might have Great Adventure beat. Magic Mountain's collection is really well-rounded, but they also just have a ton of coasters that are kind of redundant. Like, you look at a ride like West Coast Racers, it's just a combination of Full Throttle and Twisted Colossus, which really isn't the most necessary thing out there. It's a great ride, but I think that park definitely focuses more on quantity over quality. I don't think any of their coasters stack up against Great Adventure's best coaster, Hershey's best coaster, Cedar Point's best coaster. They're good, but they don't compare to those in my opinion. You look at a park like Cedar Point, they have a lot of really unique rides that kind of set them apart from the other parks, and they also have a really good collection. You have a really strong upper echelon of coasters there with Steel Vengeance, Maverick, Millennium Force, Top Thrill, Magnum, and then it kind of goes from there. Great Adventure, I do think they have a really good collection of coasters, but the issue I have is that there's quite a few clones in the lineup to really call it a top tier, the best coaster collection in the country. You have Jersey Devil, which essentially has been cloned. You have King Ka, which I wouldn't really call it a clone. I know some people would. You have Batman, which is obviously a clone. Medusa, which has been cloned at Magic Mountain. Joker, which is a clone, Dark Knight, which is a clone. There's quite a few clones at the park, but that's not necessarily degrading, but it does mean that its collection isn't really as unique as some of the other parks. And a lot of their models in general aren't as strong as other parks. Like, you look at Superman, which is their flying coaster, in my opinion, nowhere near the level of like Manta at SeaWorld or Tatsu at Magic Mountain. Batman is a really good ride, but it's nowhere near the level of the better inverts like Alpengeist, Montu, Afterburn. So I would say that it's in the upper tier of parks in terms of the coaster collection, but calling it the best over parks like Magic Mountain, Cedar Point, Hershey Park, I don't know if I could really say that. Although Flash is definitely going to add a lot to this park. I think it's really going to change the dynamics and really put another great coaster in the lineup, but again, I don't know if I could say it's better than a park like Hershey in terms of collection. And finally, so this one, well, it does say Ka should run all 4 trains, more so that they should use the dual loading and even the dual loading on one side as opposed to using both sides. I understand why they don't do this. It would cost a lot more money in terms of staffing. They would need to staff the whole platform with a lot more people than they currently do. And it's also a fairly efficient system they have set up now. I do think it'd be nice though to see the back half of the station used as like an unload station. That way when the train rolls up to the front half of the station, it's empty with the restraints open, ready to go so people can board a little quicker. I always thought that would be a nice change. But in terms of using the other side of the station, honestly, I don't think it'd be as efficient as people think. You look at a ride like Storm Runner, where you go and split into either side of the station, and it's really nice to have that, but the ride only runs 2 trains, meaning that each station section only has 1 train operating on it, so it's still going to be a slow-moving line once you get to that station side. And the same was the case with King Ka. When it ran 4 trains and it used all 4 station sections, that only had one train per station section, so you'd always be getting on the same train, meaning that you'd wind up waiting pretty much the same amount of time no matter what. So I do think the system they currently have is probably a little more efficient, although I do think it'd be cool to see something done with the rest of the station, because it's an absolutely massive station and they only use a quarter of it, which I always thought was pretty interesting. But that is going to wrap up today's edition of Great Adventure Controversial Takes. What did you guys think was the most controversial take? Which ones did you agree with, disagree with? Let me know down in the comments below. Of course, if you guys enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to Collywood Studios, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye, guys.